The small village of Cranley, St. James, had never seen anything quite like it. The news of the sudden death of Lady Eleanor Waverley had spread through the town like wildfire, leaving behind a trail of shock and confusion. But it wasn't just her passing that had the villagers whispering behind closed doors. It was the mystery surrounding it. Lady Eleanor had always been a pillar of the community, a woman of grace and composure, loved by most and feared by none. Her sudden demise, so early in her life, had left a hole in the social fabric of Cranley St. James that couldn't easily be filled. It was a loss, but it was also the beginning of something much darker. At the heart of it all was Foxglove Manor, the sprawling estate where Lady Eleanor had spent most of her life, just on the edge of the village. The manor, though outwardly majestic with its towering spires and well-tended gardens, had always carried a mysterious aura, one that seemed to hint at dark secrets beneath its surface. There was something about the family that lived there that made people uneasy. Miss Marple, the village's quiet observer, had come to know Foxglove Manor well over the years. It had been the home of Eleanor's family, and she had often visited the estate for various events, weddings, and social gatherings. But now, with Lady Eleanor's sudden death, there was an air of foreboding around the estate. The manor, for all its beauty, now seemed like a prison to its remaining inhabitants, those who had been too close to the tragedy. It wasn't long before Miss Marple received the invitation. An unexpected letter that arrived one crisp morning. The letter was from Colonel Rupert Waverley, Eleanor's father, requesting her presence at the manor. The Waverleys, despite their prominence, had always kept their distance from the common folk. But Miss Marple's reputation as a shrewd investigator had reached them nonetheless. The colonel, it seemed, had no other option but to turn to her for help. Miss Marple read the letter with careful eyes. The colonel's words were formal and to the point, but the unease that hung between the lines was palpable. Dear Miss Marple, I find myself in need of your assistance regarding the recent passing of my daughter, Lady Eleanor. There are matters, both personal and professional, that require a discerning mind, one that I trust. I would be grateful for your presence at Foxglove Manor at your earliest convenience to assist us in resolving these troubling issues. Yours sincerely, Colonel Rupert Waverley. Though the letter was not outright explicit, Miss Marple could sense that there was more to Eleanor's death than met the eye. Lady Eleanor had been in her prime, young, healthy, and seemingly content. Her sudden collapse during a family gathering had left the entire household in a state of disarray. The doctors had ruled it as a heart attack, but there had been whispers of suspicion, something unnatural in the air. Miss Marple, ever the careful observer, Carol don't think something was amiss at Foxglove Manor. She couldn't place her finger on it yet, but she could sense the dark cloud that had descended upon the estate. Later that afternoon, Miss Marple made her way to Foxglove Manor, a place that had once seemed so filled with life and laughter, but now seemed haunted by silence. As she approached the iron gates, the towering silhouette of the manor loomed ahead, its windows darkened as if it, too, were mourning the loss of its beloved lady. The long drive to the manor was lined with glistening trees, their branches swaying gently in the wind, as though they were trying to whisper something to her as she stepped out of her carriage and onto the grounds. Miss Marple was greeted by Edith Barlow, the housekeeper who had worked for the Waverleys for as long as anyone could remember. Edith was a woman of few words, but her sharp eyes and stoic demeanor told Miss Marple that there was more to her than met the eye. Miss Marple, it's a pleasure to see you, Edith said, her voice low, almost resigned. I trust you received the colonel's letter. Miss Marple nodded, studying the housekeeper's face. There was a subtle unease in her posture, a tension that suggested Edith knew more than she was letting on. I did, and I trust the colonel is expecting me, she asked softly. Yes, he is, Miss Marple. He's in the study. It's been a difficult few days for him, Edith replied, guiding Miss Marple through the grand hall and into the study, where the colonel awaited Colonel Rupert Waverley. A man whose once sturdy frame had been worn by time was seated at his desk when Miss Marple entered the study. The large room, adorned with family portraits and antique furniture, gave off an air of formality. The colonel rose as Miss Marple entered, his expression one of quiet appreciation mixed with hidden worry. "Miss Marple," he said, his voice heavy with the burden of the past few days, "thank you for coming so quickly. I hope you understand the urgency of the situation." "I do, Colonel," Miss Marple replied, her eyes steady. "But before we proceed, I must ask, do you believe there's foul play involved in Lady Eleanor's death?" The colonel paused, his eyes flickering with something between fear and doubt. I don't know," he said quietly. "The doctors assured us it was a natural death, but there are questions. Strange things that happened in the days leading up to her passing. I can't shake the feeling that something is wrong." Miss Marple listened carefully, her mind working, as she noted the colonel's hesitation. This wasn't just a grieving father. This was a man whose gut instinct told him that there was more to his daughter's death than the doctors had found. "I see," she said slowly. "I'll need to know more about the days leading up to Lady Eleanor's passing. Who was with her? Were there any unusual occurrences that you noticed?" The colonel's eyes narrowed. "There were strange things, but I don't know if I should mention them. You see, Eleanor had a visitor. The evening had settled over Foxglove Manor like a thick velvet cloak, the deep shadows playing tricks on the eyes, and the stillness of the house adding to its eerie atmosphere. Miss Marple sat opposite Colonel Waverley in his study, the quiet ticking of the clock in the corner the only sound breaking the heavy silence. He had just spoken of the mysterious visitor person whose presence had seemed to unsettle Lady Eleanor in the days before her death. "A visitor?" Miss Marple asked, leaning slightly forward, her voice soft yet sharp. "Could you tell me more about this person?" Colonel Waverley shifted uncomfortably in his chair, his hands fidgeting with the edges of a letter on his desk. His eyes darkened, and for the first time Miss Marple saw a flicker of fear in his expression. "I wasn't sure if I should mention this," he began, his voice low. "But Eleanor's strange behavior in the days before her death had something to do with a man who appeared at the manor." Miss Marple's gaze never wavered. "What kind of man was he?" The colonel paused, taking a long breath. "He was someone from Eleanor's past, someone I didn't know. He arrived unexpectedly, asking to see her. The housekeeper, Edith, seemed uneasy with his presence, though she never spoke of it openly, and Eleanor, well, she tried to hide her distress, but I could tell something wasn't right. She was anxious, perhaps even afraid." Miss Marple leaned back in her chair, folding her hands together. "And this visitor, did he leave any clue as to his identity?" Colonel's gaze dropped to the desk. "I never caught his name. He never stayed for long. But I recall he had a peculiar air about him, Miss Marple. He wasn't a family friend, nor did he seem to be someone of any consequence. But the way he spoke, there was a certain intensity in his words that unsettled me." The colonel's words lingered in the air, and Miss Marple could sense that this visitor was not merely an oddity, but a catalyst. He had been part of a series of disruptions leading to Lady Eleanor's death. But why would he appear at the manor just days before her passing? What role did he play in all of this? "I understand," Miss Marple said, after a brief pause, her voice calm and methodical. "Think it's time I speak with your staff, Colonel. The housekeeper, Edith, may know more about this visitor. And I am sure others in the household have noticed unusual behavior as well." Colonel Waverley gave a reluctant nod, his face drawn with worry. "Edith has been with us for many years. She's loyal, but she's also guarded. She won't easily share everything she knows. You'll need to be careful with her." Miss Marple gave a soft smile, one that was more knowing than anything else. I found that people who hold back the most often have the most to say, if you know how to listen. The colonel stood and gestured toward the door. I'll have Edith brought to you. She's in the kitchen preparing dinner. You'll find her there. As Miss Marple walked down the familiar, echoing halls of Foxglove Manor, the house seemed even quieter now, as if it were holding its breath. The servants' quarters were tucked away at the back of the estate, where the scent of cooking filled the air. Miss Marple found herself in the kitchen, a warm and bustling place compared to the oppressive silence of the manor's main rooms. There, in the corner, stood Edith Barlow, the housekeeper who had served the Waverley family for more than 2 decades. Her face was tightened with concern, but she was trying her best to maintain her composure. When Miss Marple approached her, Edith nodded in greeting, but made no move to offer anything beyond a few formal pleasantries. Edith, Miss Marple began softly, her tone respectful but direct. I understand you've been with the Waverley family for a long time. You know them well, don't you? Edith hesitated for a moment, then nodded. Yes, Miss Marple. I've worked here all my life. Okay, the Waverleys are like family to me. That's good to hear, Miss Marple replied, pausing to consider her next words carefully. I've been speaking with the colonel about Lady Eleanor. He's quite concerned about a visitor who arrived unexpectedly a few days ago. Hands stilled as she wiped her hands on her apron, and for a fleeting moment, Miss Marple saw the briefest flicker of nervousness in her eyes. A visitor, she repeated, her voice a little too calm. I'm afraid I don't know what you're talking about. Miss Marple smiled gently, her voice steady. I think you do, Edith. I'm sure Lady Eleanor mentioned him to you. Perhaps you saw him arrive? Edith shifted uncomfortably, casting a quick glance toward the doorway, as if looking for an escape. I didn't think there was anything unusual about him, Miss Marple. Just another man from Eleanor's past. Nothing more to it. Miss Marple's keen eyes never left Edith's face. She could tell that Edith knew more than she was willing to say. I understand, but I'm afraid the colonel believes there was something important in his presence and that something about this visitor might have played a part in Eleanor's death. For a long moment, Edith stood still, her back stiff. Miss Marple could see the conflict in the housekeeper's face, the loyalty to her employers battling against the pressure of holding onto what she knew. Finally, Edith sighed deeply, and the words came tumbling out. I don't know who he was, Miss Marple, but I remember the look on Lady Eleanor's face when she saw him. It was as if she was seeing a ghost from her past, someone she had hoped would stay buried. She tried to keep him away from the family, but he insisted. And after that visit, she became withdrawn, more so than usual. Miss Marple's thoughts swirled with new possibilities. A ghost from the past, that phrase had a weight to it. The visitor's true identity was something that now seemed even more crucial to the mystery at hand. As Miss Marple made her way back to the study, her mind was working swiftly, piecing together what she had learned. Lady Eleanor's death, though ruled in natural passing, now seemed more and more like the culmination of a much deeper story. The visitor, this man from her past, had to be at the heart of the mystery. But who was he? What was the connection that had sent Lady Eleanor into such distress? And why had he come to Foxglove Manor, of all places, just before her untimely death? Miss Marple returned to the colonel, who had been anxiously awaiting news of the investigation. Key looked up as she entered the room, his face lined with concern. Well, he asked, his voice tight. I spoke with Edith, Miss Marple replied, calmly, taking a seat. She told me about the visitor. It seems he was someone from Eleanor's past, a figure who caused her considerable distress. She didn't want him to be involved with the family, but he pressed his way in. And after that visit, Eleanor was changed, more withdrawn, anxious. It was then that the illness began. The colonel listened intently, his expression darkening with suspicion. "Do you think this man was responsible for her death?" Miss Marple leaned forward slightly, her voice gentle yet firm. "I don't know yet, Colonel. Okay. But what I do know is that there is something more to this man's presence at Foxglove Manor, something that needs to be uncovered." The late afternoon sun had dipped below the treetops, casting long shadows across the great halls of Foxglove Manor. The house, once vibrant with life, now felt hollow, its corridors echoing with the weight of silence. Miss Marple had seen many grand estates in her time, each of them filled with secrets, but there was something particularly unsettling about Foxglove Manor, something that whispered of unfinished business. She sat in Colonel Waverley's study, her hands folded neatly in her lap, her sharp mind working over the details of what she had learned so far. Lady Eleanor had been visited by a mysterious man just days before her death. His presence had caused her great distress, but no one seemed to know who he was, or, if they did, they were reluctant to say. Edith Barlow, the housekeeper, had admitted to seeing the interaction, but had revealed little beyond Eleanor's reaction. And yet, Miss Marple sensed that the housekeeper knew more than she was willing to share. Colonel Waverley stood near the fireplace, his brow furrowed in deep thought. "Miss Marple," he began, his voice strained, "I can't shake the feeling that this visitor was no stranger to my daughter. If he was merely an acquaintance from years past, why would she have been so rattled?" Miss Marple looked at him carefully. "You said before, Colonel, that Eleanor was always a private person. She had kept something from you. It was likely because she believed it would cause you distress or scandal." The Colonel exhaled sharply, rubbing a hand over his face. "It seems there was a great deal my daughter kept from me, but I refused to let her death pass without knowing the truth." Miss Marple nodded. "Then I suggest we start by learning who this man was. If no one inside this house will speak his name, perhaps someone outside of it will." Miss Marple knew that in any small village, the best place to gather information was not a grand estate, but somewhere much more humble, the local inn. There, the villagers often spoke freely, their tongues loosened by ale and familiarity. If this mysterious visitor had spent any time in Cranley St. James, someone at the King's Head Inn would have noticed as she stepped through the heavy oak door of the inn. She was greeted by the warm scent of burning wood and freshly baked bread. A few familiar faces turned her way, offering nods of acknowledgement. The innkeeper, Mr. Albert Griggs, stood behind the counter, wiping a mug clean with a cloth that had seen better days. "Miss Marple," he greeted, his round face breaking into a smile. "A pleasure, as always. What brings you here today?" Miss Marple approached the bar, offering a kind but purposeful smile. "I was wondering, Mr. Griggs, if you might help me with something. I believe a gentleman of some distinction arrived in the village recently. He's tall, dark-haired, perhaps a little intense in manner." Griggs raised an eyebrow, setting the mug down. I remember him. Came through here about a week ago. Didn't stay long, just enough for a drink and a few questions." Miss Marple's fingers tightened around her handbag. "Questions? What sort of questions?" Griggs frowned. He was asking about Foxglove Manor, about the Waverleys, seemed keen on finding out whether Lady Eleanor was still living there. Miss Marple's heart gave a small jolt. Did he mention his name? Griggs hesitated, didn't give one, but he paid with a worn silver coin note with a strange marking on it. Said it had sentimental value. Miss Marple's mind whirred. A worn silver coin that was an unusual item to carry. It suggested a connection to the past, something old, something forgotten, or something deliberately left behind. With this new information in mind, Miss Marple returned to Foxglove Manor, her thoughts turning over the strange visitor and what his interest in Eleanor had been. The coin, the inquiries, Eleanor's distress, all pointed to something from her past as she stepped inside. Edith Barlow was waiting for her, arms crossed over her chest. "Miss Marple," the housekeeper said, her voice low. "There's something I didn't tell you before." Miss Marple lifted a brow, but said nothing, waiting patiently. Edith glanced around as if to ensure no one was listening, then sighed. The man, he wasn't just any visitor. He knew Lady Eleanor from long ago. When I heard his voice, it took me a moment, but I remembered. His name was Simon Harcourt. The name sent a ripple of recognition through Miss Marple's mind. Simon Harcourt. Why did that sound familiar? Edith continued, her voice hushed. He was from Eleanor's youth, back when she was still a girl. He used to visit Foxglove Manor often until, one day, he didn't. There was some scandal, though I never knew the details. But Eleanor never spoke of him after that, until now. Miss Marple's lips pressed into a thin line. The past, as always, had a way of returning when least expected. And now, it seemed, Simon Harcourt had returned, not just to visit, but to stir up whatever had been buried all those years ago. Miss Marple sat alone in the parlor, sipping tea, as she considered what she had learned. Simon Harcourt, a man from Eleanor's past, had reappeared, and shortly after, Eleanor had fallen ill and died. Coincidence? No, Miss Marple never believed in coincidence. Eleanor's distress, her withdrawn demeanor, the way she had avoided speaking about Simonette, all suggested something more than just an old acquaintance reappearing. There was a secret between them, something that had remained hidden until now. Miss Marple placed her tea down carefully. There was only one way forward. She would have to find Simon Harcourt, cover his history with Eleanor, and discover what had driven him back to Cranley St. James after all these years. Whatever had happened so long ago, she had a sinking feeling that it had finally caught up to Eleanor and perhaps had even killed her. As the evening settled over Foxglove Manor, Miss Marple knew that she was getting closer to the truth. The question was, would the truth be enough to catch a killer? The fire in Foxglove Manor's great hearth crackled softly, casting flickering shadows along the dark wooden paneling of the parlor. Miss Marple sat with her hands resting lightly on her lap, her thoughts circling the name she had just learned. Simon Harcourt. It was a name that had resurfaced after years of silence, a name that had caused Lady Eleanor Waverley's distress just before her death. And now Miss Marple was certain that name was the key to everything. Outside, the trees swayed in the cool evening wind, their branches scratching against the windows as if the very house were whispering secrets of its own. Colonel Waverley sat across from her, rubbing his temple with a weary hand. His eyes darkened by the weight of loss. "Simon Harcourt," the colonel murmured at last, his voice quiet but carrying the weight of years of unspoken history. "Haven't heard that name in, I don't know how long. Not since Eleanor was a girl." Miss Marple's gaze was steady. "Tell me about him, Colonel." The colonel sighed, his shoulders sinking into his chair. He was a charming young man, the kind who made people feel they were the only person in the room when he spoke to them. He and Eleanor were close, at least for a time. But there was something about him, something that always felt a little too smooth, a little too rehearsed. My wife, God rest her soul, never trusted him. She always said he was dangerous. Miss Marple tilted her head slightly. And yet, he disappeared from Eleanor's life. Why? Colonel Waverley exhaled, looking toward the window as though the past itself might walk through it. I never knew for certain. One day, he was here, part of her world. The next, he was gone, and Eleanor refused to speak of him again. I assumed he had broken her heart. But, hey, if he returned now, all these years later, just before she died, Miss Marple's expression softened, though her mind remained sharp. Then it was not a coincidence. His return, Eleanor's illness, her distress, all must be connected. The colonel nodded grimly. "You must understand, Miss Marple, I'm an old man, seen enough of the world to know that when the past returns, it rarely does so without a price." Miss Marple took a slow sip of her tea, her thoughts worry. If Simon Harcourt's reappearance had sent Eleanor into such distress, then the answer to her death lay not in the present, but in a secret long buried. There was only one thing to do now: find Simon Harcourt. Miss Marple was not one to waste time. The next morning she set out for the village inn once more, where Albert Griggs, the innkeeper, had first mentioned Harcourt's brief visit. If anyone in Cranley St. James knew where Harcourt had gone, it would be someone who had seen him last. The air was crisp with the promise of an approaching autumn, the streets quieter than usual, as if the village itself sensed the unease that had settled over Foxglove Manor. As Miss Marple entered the King's Head Inn, she found Griggs polishing the counter, his keen eyes watching the few patrons who lingered over their morning drinks. "Back so soon, Miss Marple?" he asked with a grin, though it didn't quite reach his eyes. "What can I do for you?" Miss Marple approached the bar, her voice pleasant but firm. "Mr. Griggs, you mentioned the gentleman who visited recently, the one asking about Foxglove Manor. I believe I now have a name for him: Simon Harcourt." Griggs's hand paused mid-polish, his face flickering with something between recognition and caution. "Harcourt, you say?" he muttered, setting the glass down. "Aye, that rings a bell." Miss Marple leaned in slightly. "What else do you remember?" Griggs sighed. "He wasn't like other travelers. There was something about him. He came in quiet-like, but his eyes, they were sharp, always watching. He asked about Eleanor, yes, but he also asked about Foxglove Manor's secrets." Miss Marple's fingers curled slightly against the counter. "Secrets?" Griggs nodded. Not in so many words, but he was probing, trying to find out what folks knew about the Waverleys. "I didn't think much of it at the time. Thought he was just another man chasing after old stories. But now that you mention his name, I remember something else." Miss Marple waited, patient as always. "He left in a hurry," Griggs continued, lowering his voice. "Didn't even finish his drink. Got up and walked out like something had spooked him." Miss Marple's eyes narrowed. "And where did he go?" Griggs hesitated, then sighed. "I don't know for sure, but he mentioned heading to the old chapel ruins, you know? That place just beyond the village, past the woods." Miss Marple straightened slightly. "The old chapel. Whatever for?" Griggs shook his head. "I can't say. If he's looking for answers, that's where he went." Miss Marple knew that name well. The old chapel ruins, a place that had once been a place of worship, long since abandoned, left to crumble under time's weight. But why would Simon Harcourt go there? There was only one way to find out. That afternoon, Miss Marple made her way toward the outskirts of Cranley St. James, her pace steady as she followed the winding path toward the old chapel ruins. The air grew colder as she walked, and the thick canopy of trees overhead blocked out much of the daylight, giving the place an almost otherworldly feel. As she reached the clearing where the ruins lay, Miss Marple slowed. The stone walls, crumbling from age, stood silent and foreboding, the place long since forgotten by time. But as she stepped forward, something caught her eye: a figure, half hidden in the shadows. Simon Harcourt. The man stood with his back to her, his hands in his coat pockets, staring at something unseen in the distance. He must have heard her approach, for he turned slightly, his dark eyes narrowing as they met hers. "Miss Marple," said, his voice smooth but edged with something calculating. "I was wondering when you'd find me." Miss Marple met his gaze, unflinching. "Then you must know why I'm here." A slow, knowing smile crossed his face. "Yes, you want to know about Eleanor." Miss Marple's voice was calm, measured. "I want to know why she was so afraid of you." For the briefest moment, something flickered across Harcourt's face, an emotion too quick to name. Then he let out a soft chuckle, shaking his head. "Afraid?" he repeated. "Oh no, Miss Marple. Eleanor wasn't afraid of me. She was afraid, of what I knew. A chill ran down Miss Marple's spine. There it was. The truth was within reach. But what secret had Eleanor tried so desperately to keep buried? A damp chill settled over the old chapel ruins, the crumbling walls standing as silent sentinels of a past long forgotten. The air smelled of moss and damp stone, and the fading light, filtering through the overgrown branches, cast eerie shadows. Across the weathered floor, Miss Marple faced Simon Harcourt, the man who had reappeared from Lady Eleanor's past. His dark eyes filled with a knowing amusement, as if he were playing a game only he understood. Her voice was steady, her gaze unflinching. "You said Eleanor wasn't afraid of you, Mr. Harcourt told me of what you knew. I believe it's time you told me exactly what that was." Simon's lips curled into a faint, unreadable smile. "You're quite persistent, Miss Marple, but I suppose that's why you're here." He turned away slightly, glancing toward the ruins as though recalling something long buried. "Eleanor and I shared a secret, one she never wanted anyone to uncover. And yet, here you are, digging it up." Miss Marple remained silent, waiting. The best way to get a man like Simon Harcourt to speak was to let him believe he controlled the conversation. After a moment, Kay sighed, tucking his hands into the pockets of his coat. "Eleanor and I were close once. But our story isn't some tragic romance, Miss Marple. No, it was something much more complicated." He turned back to her, his expression suddenly serious. "Tell me, has anyone ever spoken to you about the Waverley inheritance?" Miss Marple's mind sharpened at the words. The Waverley inheritance. A family as old and well-established as the Waverleys would certainly have wealth and property to pass down. But there had been no mention of any controversy surrounding it. She adjusted her shawl against the evening's chill. "I am familiar with the family's history, Mr. Harcourt, but I suspect you're referring to something specific." Simon chuckled softly. "Indeed. See, Eleanor wasn't meant to inherit Foxglove Manor at all." Miss Marple's brows lifted slightly. "Not meant to inherit." That was an intriguing revelation. Simon stepped closer, lowering his voice. "The Waverleys had an eldest son, Hugh, Eleanor's older brother." Miss Marple nodded. She had heard of Hugh Waverley, but knew very little of him. "He died, tragically, didn't he? Riding accident?" Simon exhaled through his nose, a humorless laugh escaping him. "That's the official story. Yes, cool. But accidents don't usually involve unsigned wills and sudden alterations to family fortunes." Miss Marple's sharp mind immediately latched onto the implication. "Do you mean to suggest that Hugh's death wasn't accidental at all?" Simon's expression darkened. "I mean to suggest that Hugh Waverley knew something dangerous, and he paid for it." Miss Marple considered the weight of Simon's words. If Hugh Waverley's death had been more than an accident, then Lady Eleanor's recent distress made far more sense. She had buried something from that time, and Simon Harcourt had returned to unearth it. She regarded him carefully. "What exactly did Hugh know, Mr. Harcourt?" Simon's gaze flickered toward the ruins once more, his expression unreadable. "That's the part I never uncovered myself, Miss Marple. Oh, but Eleanor did. And when I returned, she knew I had come back to finish what we started, to finally learn the truth." Miss Marple tilted her head slightly. "Then Eleanor's distress wasn't because she feared you, but because she feared what you might find." Simon gave a slow nod. "Yes, but she didn't have to worry. Someone got to her first." A chill ran down Miss Marple's spine. "You mean?" Simon exhaled sharply. "Me, she didn't die of natural causes, Miss Marple. Eleanor was murdered." The sky had darkened considerably by the time Miss Marple arrived back at Foxglove Manor, the once grand estate now feeling even more foreboding in the gathering gloom. She stepped inside, her resolve firm. The pieces of the puzzle were finally falling into place. If Hugh Waverley's death had been orchestrated to protect a secret, Eleanor had spent years suppressing what she had learned. Then her untimely death was no accident either. Someone had been desperate to keep the past buried and had been willing to kill to ensure it remained that way. She found Colonel Waverley in his study, a glass of brandy in his hand, his expression weary. "You've been gone some time, Miss Marple," he said, though there was no accusation in his tone. Miss Marple lowered herself into the chair across from him, her hands folded neatly. "Colonel, I need you to tell me the truth about Hugh Waverley's death." The Colonel's grip on his glass tightened. "Why do you ask?" "Because I believe Eleanor was murdered," Miss Marple said plainly, "and I believe it is directly connected to what happened to her brother." For a long moment, Colonel Waverley said nothing. The only sound in the room was the soft ticking of the mantel clock. Then, with a heavy sigh, he set down his glass and ran a hand through his graying hair. "Hugh was always different," he admitted, his voice lower now, almost as if he feared being overheard. "He was the true heir to Foxglove Manor, but he wasn't interested in wealth or titles. He had a curious mind, always asking questions, always looking into things he shouldn't. And then, one day, he started speaking about a betrayal within our family." Miss Marple listened carefully, sensing the long-buried pain in the Colonel's words. "He had found something," the Colonel continued, "some letter or document. I never knew exactly what it was, but he was determined to confront the family about it." He swallowed hard. "And then, just days later, he was dead." Miss Marple's voice was gentle but firm. "And Eleanor, did she ever say what she had learned?" The Colonel looked away. "She never spoke of it. Not once. But after Hugh died, something in her changed. She became guarded, as if she knew that if she asked too many questions, she might share his fate." Miss Marple's heart ached for the woman who had carried this burden alone for so many years. "She must have finally found the truth," Miss Marple murmured. "And someone who has been watching all these years couldn't risk her exposing it." The Colonel's jaw tightened. "Then tell me, Miss Marple, who in this house would do such a thing?" Miss Marple sat back, her mind assembling the final pieces of the puzzle. There were only a handful of people who had known both Eleanor and Hugh's secrets. The killer was close, far closer than they realized. She exhaled softly, looking the Colonel straight in the eye. "I believe I know," she said, "and I intend to prove it." The stillness of Foxglove Manor was deceptive. Though the house was silent, it was a silence that pulsed with secrets, with something lurking just beneath the surface. Miss Marple had felt it from the moment she arrived at the tension, the whispers, the carefully concealed glances. And now, after her conversation with Colonel Waverley, she was certain someone in this house had murdered Lady Eleanor. She sat alone in the grand parlor, the fire in the hearth casting flickering shadows along the walls. Her mind was methodically sorting through the puzzle, arranging the pieces into something that resembled truth. Hugh Waverley's death had never been an accident. That much was now evident. The young heir had stumbled upon a secret one that someone in the household had been desperate to keep buried. And Eleanor had rediscovered that secret. Her hands tightened around the embroidery in her lap as her thoughts sharpened. But what was the secret itself? What had Hugh known that had led to his accident? What had Eleanor found that had cost her life? And most importantly, who had the most to lose if the truth came out? Miss Marple knew the time for quiet observation had passed. If she was to uncover the truth, she had to act swiftly. She had to force the killer's hand. She stood and smoothed her skirts, her decision made. If Eleanor had been murdered because of something she had learned, then it was likely she had left some trace of that knowledge behind. The killer had silenced her, but they couldn't erase the evidence of what she had discovered. Miss Marple sought out Colonel Waverley in his study, where he sat, lost in thought, staring at a half-finished glass of brandy. He looked up as she entered, his face drawn. "Miss Marple," he murmured, "I haven't been able to rest since our conversation. If what you say is true, if Eleanor was murdered, then we cannot allow this crime to go unpunished." Miss Marple nodded, lowering herself into the chair across from him. "There is one thing I must ask of you, Colonel. Anything, Kay?" She met his gaze, her own calm but firm. "I need access to Eleanor's private things, her writing desk, her letters, her journals." The Colonel hesitated. "Do you truly believe she left something behind?" Miss Marple's expression didn't waver. "If Eleanor found proof of what happened to Hugh, she would have recorded it. She would have kept it safe. And the person responsible for her death would not have risked leaving it in the open." Colonel Waverly exhaled, rubbing a hand over his face. "Very well. Her rooms have remained untouched since her passing. Edith has been keeping them in order." Edith, the housekeeper. Miss Marple's eyes flickered with thought. Edith had been loyal to the Waverly family for years. But loyalty was a curious thing. Was she protecting the family or protecting someone specific within it? Miss Marple climbed the grand staircase, the old wooden steps creaking softly beneath her feet. Lady Eleanor's bedroom lay at the end of the corridor, its heavy oak door firmly shut. The air was thick with stillness as Miss Marple turned the brass handle and stepped inside. The room was pristine, untouched since Eleanor's passing. The bed was neatly made, the curtains drawn halfway. A delicate writing desk sat beneath the window, its polished surface gleaming in the dim light. Miss Marple made her way to it, running her fingers along the edges before carefully opening the drawers. Inside, she found the usual personal effects stationery: pressed flowers, bundle of old letters tied with ribbon. She untied the bundle and leafed through the letters, her sharp eyes scanning the delicate script. They were mostly correspondences with friends, nothing unusual. Then, near the bottom of the pile, she found something different: a single scrap of paper, torn from a larger sheet, and written on it, in Lady Eleanor's hand, were 3 words: "The Chapel, midnight." Miss Marple's breath caught. The chapel, the very place Simon Harcourt had been drawn to. Someone had met Eleanor there, someone who had a secret to protect, and now Miss Marple knew how to catch them. The next morning, Miss Marple gathered everyone in the grand drawing room of Foxglove Manor: the Colonel, Edith. The remaining staff, each of them, had a part to play in this mystery. She stood at the center of the room, her presence quiet but commanding. "I have reason to believe," she began, "that Lady Eleanor's death was not natural, as we have been led to believe. I now know that she had been meeting with someone who did not want their past to come to light." A murmur of unease rippled through the room. Colonel Waverly stood, his face dark with suspicion. "Who was it, Miss Marple?" Miss Marple let the silence stretch. "Kay." Then her gaze landed firmly on Edith. The housekeeper's expression didn't change, "Kay," but in her stillness, in the slight stiffening of her posture, Miss Marple saw what she had been looking for. "You knew?" Miss Marple said softly. "You knew what Eleanor had found? You knew she was meeting someone at the chapel that night?" For the first time, Edith blinked. "I don't know what you mean, Miss Marple," she said, but her voice lacked its usual steadiness. Miss Marple stepped forward. "Eleanor left a note for herself, a note about a midnight meeting at the chapel. You must have seen it." The housekeeper hesitated, but Colonel Waverly's voice cut through the tension. "Edith," he said, his voice low, "what did you do?" A long silence, and then Edith let out a shuddering sigh. "I didn't want to hurt her," she whispered. Miss Marple's sharp eyes softened, but only slightly. "Then tell us what happened." Edith clenched her hands. Together, her face lined with grief. "I overheard her speaking to Simon Harcourt. I heard her say she had proof about Hugh's death. If she had told the colonel, the entire family's name would have been ruined. Everything they had built would have come crashing down. Colonel Waverly's face darkened. And so you silenced her. Tears welled in Edith's eyes. I only meant to frighten her, to make her drop it. She fought back. She fell. Miss Marple exhaled softly. The truth was laid bare at last. Eleanor had not been poisoned, nor struck down by an assassin. She had confronted Edith with what she knew, and in a desperate struggle to keep the past hidden. Edith had pushed her too hard. The past had claimed another victim. A solemn quiet had settled over Foxglove Manor, its once grand halls now burdened with the weight of truth. Miss Marple sat by the study's great fireplace, her delicate hands folded over her lap as she reflected on the events that had unfolded. The mystery of Lady Eleanor's death had finally been exposed, and yet there was still something unresolved. Edith Barlow had confessed, admitting that she had confronted Eleanor at the chapel that fateful night, fearful of what she had uncovered about Hugh Waverly's death. But Miss Marple had sensed something in Edith's voice, something deeper than guilt alone. There was a hesitation, a reluctance, as though the housekeeper had not revealed the full truth. Miss Marple had solved how Eleanor had died, but she had not yet solved why, and she intended to. Miss Marple turned her gaze toward Colonel Waverly. Coy sat across from her, his expression etched with sorrow. I still cannot believe it, Colonel murmured, rubbing his temples. Edith has been with us for so many years. Could she have done this? Miss Marple's voice was gentle but firm. 'Cause she was protecting something, Colonel. Or rather, she believed she was. The Colonel's eyes flickered with something doubt, perhaps hope. Protecting what? Miss Marple exhaled slowly. She claimed it was the family's reputation. That Eleanor had discovered something about Hugh's death. Something that, if revealed, would have destroyed everything. The Colonel gave a slow nod. Hugh was reckless, but he was my son. If Eleanor truly found something that proved his death wasn't an accident, he swallowed hard. What was it? Miss Marple tapped her fingers lightly against the arm of her chair. That was the final question, the last thread still dangling loose. Eleanor had known the truth, but where had she left it? There was one place left to look. Miss Marple rose from her chair, smoothing her skirts. Colonel, I must see Eleanor's things one more time. The Colonel frowned, but nodded. You are welcome to whatever you need. Together, they climbed the winding staircase to Lady Eleanor's room. The space had remained untouched, as though waiting for her return. The air held a faint trace of her lavender perfume, retained the scent mixing with the cold breeze drifting in through the window. Miss Marple went straight to Eleanor's writing desk, running her fingers lightly over the surface. She had already searched through it before, but this time she was looking for something more carefully hidden. She methodically checked the drawers, then ran her hand underneath the desk. Nothing. Then she noticed it. A small panel, slightly loose, on the underside of the desk. With careful fingers, she pried it open, and inside she found a folded envelope. The edges were crisp, as though it had been placed there only recently. With a quiet intake of breath, she carefully unfolded the letter. Her eyes scanned the delicate script, her heart quickening as she absorbed the words. Then, very slowly, she placed the letter down on the desk and looked up at the Colonel. Eleanor did discover the truth, she murmured, and she put it in writing. Colonel Waverly hesitated before stepping forward, his hands unsteady as he picked up the letter. His eyes moved across the neatly penned lines, his face growing paler with each passing moment. When he finally looked up, his voice was hoarse. It can't be. Miss Marple's expression was unreadable. It can, Colonel, and it is. The letter was from Hugh Waverly himself, written just days before his death. I fear I have uncovered something terrible. There is a deception in this family, one that has been hidden for too long. If anything happens to me, know that I did not act in haste. I was silenced, and I fear I know by whom." Miss Marple let the words settle before speaking. "Hugh was not reckless, Colonel. He did not die by accident. He was murdered." A deep silence filled the room. The Colonel's hands trembled as he placed the letter back on the desk. "Who?" he whispered. "Who would do this?" Miss Marple sighed. "That is the final question, isn't it?" She met his eyes, her voice quiet yet certain. Eleanor knew. She had proof. But Edith was not the only one who feared what might come to light. The Colonel's expression twisted. "You mean?" Miss Marple gave a small nod. "Yes, Colonel. The true murderer is still in this house." The room darkened as the evening set in, the wind rattling against the window panes. Miss Marple sat in the center of the drawing room once again, this time with the entire household gathered before her. She had summoned them one by one. The Colonel, the remaining staff, and, of course, Simon Harcourt. The tension was palpable. Miss Marple cleared her throat, her voice steady. "Lady Eleanor was murdered because she uncovered the truth. But the person responsible for her death is the same person who killed Hugh Waverley all those years ago." A stunned silence. Then, a voice low and trembling. "You're saying it was the same person?" Miss Marple nodded. "Hugh found something. Something that would have changed the course of the Waverley family forever. And he was silenced. When Eleanor discovered it, she too was silenced." Her gaze fell on Simon Harcourt. "You knew, didn't you?" she said softly. "You knew Eleanor had found the proof." Simon's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. Real murderer was someone who had the most to lose, someone who had lived within Foxglove Manor's walls all this time. Miss Marple let the silence stretch, then turned her eyes toward Colonel Waverley. "I believe, Colonel, that the murderer is someone very close to you?" The air seemed to freeze, and then the truth fell like a hammer. The Colonel's own brother Reginald Waverley, the quiet, exclusive uncle who had always remained on the fringes of the family, who had never been suspected. He had been the one to orchestrate Hugh's death, to ensure that Eleanor never spoke a word. And now his crimes were finally uncovered. Reginald Waverley had been exposed, his carefully maintained facade shattered by Miss Marple's deductions. As the constables led him away, Foxglove Manor seemed to breathe once more, as if the very walls had been freed of their long-held secrets. Colonel Waverley stood in stunned silence, his entire world altered by the truth. Miss Marple, ever gentle, touched his arm. "The past never remains buried forever, Colonel. The truth has a way of surfacing." The old man exhaled shakily, nodding. "And I suppose I must learn to live with it." A week later, the chill of late autumn had settled over Foxglove Manor, weaving through its vast gardens, rustling the last golden leaves that clung stubbornly to the great oak trees. A soft mist hovered over the hedgerows, winding through the ivy-covered stone walls, as if the house itself were exhaling after years of holding its breath. Miss Marple walked alone through the gravel pathways, her pace unhurried. The estate, though still grand, no longer carried the same shroud of secrecy that had once lingered over it. The truth had finally been spoken aloud, and with it, the ghosts of the past had begun to dissolve into memory. She paused near a small stone bench tucked away in a quiet corner of the garden. The air was crisp, but not unkind, and a distant blackbird trilled from an overhanging branch. In her hand, she held a single white rose, its petals untouched by the frost. She placed it gently on the bench, letting her fingers linger for a moment. It was a simple, tributed gesture of remembrance for two souls who had paid the price for the truth, Eleanor and Hugh. One had lived with the burden of knowing, the other had died for discovering. And in the end, neither had been able to escape. the weight of their family's past. Miss Marple exhaled softly, her breath visible in the crisp morning air. The past had been uncovered. Justice had been served. But as with all tragedies, there was a sadness that would never truly fade. She adjusted her shawl and turned, her steps slow as she walked away. One mystery had ended. There were always more to come, and she would be there, watching always. The village of Cranley, St. James, had returned to its usual routines, though the aftermath of Foxglove Manor's secrets still rippled through its quiet streets. The gossip that had once filled the air with whispers of murder and scandal had softened. Kate, turning into a hushed reverence for the Waverley family and all they had lost at the King's Head Inn. Mr. Albert Griggs was back to wiping down his counter, though now with a newfound appreciation for caution when discussing his patrons. "Terrible business, all of it," he murmured to one of the regulars, his usual jovial tone subdued. "Never would have guessed it'd be Reginald Waverley, of all people." His companion, a stout woman who often took her tea by the fireplace, shook her head. "That's the thing about secrets, Mr. Griggs. They don't stay buried forever." Outside, villagers went about their business, stopping now and then to glance toward Foxglove Manor, the grandeur of its estate unchanged. Yet somehow it's different. There were still echoes of the past in its towering spires and vast, laced windows, but the looming weight of its darkest days had been lifted. Back at her cottage, Miss Marple sat near the hearth, a warm fire crackling as she poured herself a fresh cup of tea. A familiar knock at the door made her glance up, and when she opened it, she found Colonel Rupert Waverley standing on her threshold. "Colonel," she greeted, stepping aside to let him in. What a surprise! The Colonel removed his hat, his expression tired but lighter than it had been in days. "I thought I might call on you, Miss Marple. There was something I wanted to say." She led him to a seat by the fire, and he accepted a cup of tea, though he did not drink from it immediately. After a moment, he sighed. "I don't know how to thank you," he admitted. "If not for you, the truth about Eleanor and Hugh would have remained hidden forever." Miss Marple gave a small, understanding smile. "It is never easy to face the truth, Colonel, especially when it comes at such a terrible cost." The Colonel stared into the flames, his expression pensive. "Edith, she truly believed she was protecting. U.S., he murmured, "and Reginald, my own brother. How could I have been so blind?" Miss Marple's voice was gentle but firm. "Guilt and fear make people do terrible things. Edith's devotion to your family became her downfall, and Reginald, well, greed has long been the most dangerous of motives." The Colonel nodded slowly, setting his untouched cup of tea down. "And now I must carry on. The Waverley name must endure, even after all this." Miss Marple studied him thoughtfully. "Perhaps, Colonel, it is not about preserving the name, but about reshaping it. Foxglove Manor has carried secrets long enough. It is time to fill it with something new, something built on honesty, rather than the weight of the past." The Colonel gave her a small, weary smile. "Wise as ever, Miss Marple." He stood, adjusting his coat. "I won't take up any more of your time, but I wanted you to know, if you ever need anything, you have a friend at Foxglove Manor." Miss Marple inclined her head. "And you, Colonel, will always have an ally in me." With a final nod, he departed, leaving Miss Marple alone with her thoughts in the quiet warmth of the fire. As the embers in the hearth glowed softly, Miss Marple reached for her knitting, her fingers moving with practiced ease. Another case had come to a close. She had always known that the past had a way of creeping into the present. That secrets were like ivy. They clung tightly, winding their way into the very foundations of things, refusing to let go. But she had also learned something else. People were not simply good or bad. They were shaped by their fears, their regrets, their choices. Edith had been loyal, but loyalty could be blinding. Reginald had been cunning, but greed had made him careless. And Eleanor had carried the burden of truth, unable to outrun it. Miss Marple sighed, setting her knitting aside. The world was never short of mysteries, never lacking in people who thought they could hide from the past. And that was why she would always be needed. She stood, crossing to the window, looking out at the peaceful village beyond. The case of Foxglove Manor was over, but there would always be another puzzle to solve, another truth to uncover. And when the time came, she would be there, watching, always.